The voicemail was 43 seconds long. 43 seconds that Miriam Holt played 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table at 6 in the morning, with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, listening to her son-in-law's voice fill the room like something she needed to document before it disappeared. "Listen," Darren said on the recording, his voice carrying that particular blend of casual and cutting that Miriam had learned to recognize over 11 years of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, and every occasion where she'd smiled and passed the breadbasket and told herself family was worth the friction. "I know you think you're helping, but Helen and I talked about it, and honestly, we need you to pull back. You're at the house too much. The kids are getting confused about boundaries. And, look, I don't know how to say this without it sounding harsh, but you're kind of a weight on the whole family dynamic right now." Helen agrees. "We both do." He'd left that message at 11:47 on a Thursday night. His phone must have called her by accident, because right after that, Miriam heard him say to Helen, clear as anything, "She'll be upset for a week, and then she'll get over it. She always does." And then the call ended. Miriam sat with that for a long time. She was 54 years old. She had brown hair that she'd let go silver at the temples because she'd earned it. She drove a 12-year-old Honda that needed new brake pads. She wore the kind of clothes that made cashiers overlook her, that made hotel front desks look past her toward whoever was standing behind her in line. She had the kind of face that people forgot at parties, the kind of bearing that restaurants gave the table near the kitchen. What Darren Okafor did not know, what almost no one in that neighborhood knew, what Helen herself had been asked to keep private for reasons that were now making a great deal of sense, was that Miriam Holt was the sitting chief judge of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. She had been appointed 14 years ago. She had presided over cases that made the front page of the Times. She had a security detail she'd declined. She had a $2.4 million apartment in Tribeca that she used during court weeks, and a house upstate that she loved, and a brokerage account that would make Darren Okafor's hands shake if he ever saw the number. She also had, right now, a cold cup of coffee and a voicemail that she was going to handle with the same deliberate patience she applied to everything that mattered. She didn't call Helen back that morning. She didn't call her back that afternoon either. What Miriam knew about her daughter's marriage that Helen didn't think she knew. Darren had quit his job at the architecture firm 8 months ago. He'd told Helen it was a mutual decision, a strategic pivot, time to launch the independent practice he'd been planning for years. What he had not told Helen was that the firm had asked him to leave following a billing dispute that was still being reviewed. Miriam knew this because one of the partners was a former colleague, and former colleagues talked. And Miriam was the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke. She also knew that the house in Westchester, the 4-bedroom colonial that Darren referred to as "our place," in a tone that suggested he'd built it himself, had been purchased almost entirely with Helen's trust fund, a trust that Miriam herself had established when Helen was born and had quietly grown over the decades without ever making a production of it. What Miriam knew about Darren that Darren didn't know she knew. He'd borrowed $40,000 from Helen's personal account 11 months ago to fund his new practice. He'd told Helen it was temporary. The account had not been replenished. She knew all of this the way she knew most things. Not from snooping, not from interrogating, but from paying attention while other people assumed she wasn't worth paying attention to. She poured the cold coffee down the drain. Then she called her estate attorney. Miriam's attorney was a woman named Cecile Fontaine, 61 years old, who had been managing Miriam's legal and financial affairs for 19 years and who understood implicitly that when Miriam called without a scheduled appointment, it was not a social call. "I need to revisit the trust structure," Miriam said. "And the house." "Which house?" "The one in Westchester." There was a brief pause. Cecile had been present at the closing of that house. She knew what it had cost, and more importantly, she knew whose money it had been. "How comprehensive do you want this?" "Comprehensive," Miriam said. They met in person the following Tuesday. What most people didn't understand about trust law, and what Darren Okafor certainly didn't understand, was how precisely and quietly these instruments could be modified when the person who created them decided the original conditions no longer served their purpose. Helen's trust had been structured with Miriam as trustee until Helen turned 40. Helen was 36. That meant Miriam retained full legal authority to redirect, restructure, or otherwise modify the trust's provisions without anyone's consent but her own. She did not move to harm Helen. That was never the point, and it would never be the point, because Helen was her daughter, and Miriam had been loving her since before she took her first breath. But she moved to protect Helen. Quietly, deliberately. The way she did everything. She spent 3 weeks meeting with Cecile, reviewing documents, making decisions. She reviewed the property deed on the Westchester house. She reviewed Helen's joint accounts. She reviewed the structure of a fund that Darren had apparently named himself as secondary beneficiary on 18 months ago, a move so subtle that Helen hadn't mentioned it, possibly hadn't noticed. Miriam noticed. She made changes. Legal, careful, fully documented changes. By the time she was done, the financial architecture around her daughter had been quietly, thoroughly, irrevocably restructured in ways that removed Darren Okafor from every equation that mattered. She did not announce any of this. She simply waited for a Tuesday in October when Helen called and asked if she wanted to come for dinner on Saturday. "I'd love that," Miriam said. She brought wine. A good Burgundy, the kind that Darren would immediately identify as expensive and then try to talk about with an authority he didn't quite have. She also brought a small carved wooden box she'd picked up at a craft market upstate, the kind of thing that cost $20 and looked like it cost $100, and she gave it to her granddaughter Lena with the same care she'd give something precious, because Lena was 8 and 8-year-olds deserved to feel like everything given to them was precious. Dinner was lamb chops and roasted vegetables. Helen had made them. Helen was a good cook, one of the many things about her daughter that Miriam suspected Darren had stopped noticing. They ate. They talked about Lena's school and the neighbor's renovation and a documentary Helen had watched twice. Darren was in a particular kind of mood, expansive, generous. The performance of a man who has already decided he's the most important person at the table and is now demonstrating his magnanimity. He refilled Miriam's wine without being asked. He asked about her little retirement hobby. He'd been calling her judicial career that for 3 years now, a joke that had never quite landed as a joke because it wasn't quite one. And she said it was keeping her busy. "You should really take more time for yourself," he said in the tone of someone bestowing advice. "At your stage, you know. Slow down. Enjoy things." Miriam smiled at him across the table and said, "That's good advice, Darren." He nodded, satisfied. After dinner, while Helen put Lena to bed, Miriam sat in the living room with Darren and a small glass of the Burgundy and the quiet comfort of knowing things he didn't. "Listen," he said, and she recognized the tone immediately, the settling in, the shift of weight, the voice dropping half a register, the voicemail voice. "I know my message a few weeks ago came out a little rough. I just want you to know it comes from a place of caring. About the family. About structure." "Of course," Miriam said. "Helen needs to be able to focus on the kids and on us without, additional pressure. You understand?" "I do understand," Miriam said. He seemed pleased by that. "I actually wanted to mention something," he continued smoothly, the way he moved when he felt the room was his. "The practice is at a point where we're looking at expansion. I've been thinking about approaching some investor's family mostly, and I thought maybe you'd want to be part of that conversation, given your position." He said the last 2 words with a slight emphasis, as though her position were a tool he was selecting from a drawer. "What kind of investment?" Miriam asked. "Seed capital, really. 80,000. It's a strong opportunity." Miriam nodded slowly, as though considering this. What Darren saw, a 60-year-old woman in a cardigan, turning a wineglass in her hand, thinking about whether she could afford to be helpful. What Miriam was actually thinking. She'd reviewed his business registration documents 3 weeks ago. The independent practice had 2 clients, both deferred. His overhead was running 50% above his revenue. He'd already taken 40,000 from Helen. Now he was coming back for 80 more. "I'll think about it," she said. "Great." He stood up to check on something in the kitchen, and as he left the room, he passed the bookshelf where Miriam had noticed. Months ago, a photo of their wedding had been moved to the back row and replaced in the front by a print of Darren at some professional event, shaking hands with someone important. Small things. People always revealed themselves in small things. She thought about Helen on the drive back upstate. Helen, who had been a serious little girl who collected rocks and read field guides and knew the genus names of 6 different types of hawk by age 10. Helen, who had gotten into Columbia on her own work and graduated with honors and gone on to build a career in environmental consulting that she'd quietly set aside when Lena was born because Darren had been certain, absolutely certain, that this was the right choice for the family. Helen, who hadn't consulted her mother about any of it. Not because they weren't close, but because Helen had been raised to make her own decisions, and Miriam had respected that even when it was difficult, even when she'd sat in her car outside their house some evenings just breathing, she was not going to swoop in. She was not going to rescue or announce or position herself as the cavalry. She was going to make sure that if Helen ever needed an exit, there was a door, unlocked, fully funded. That was what a mother did, in Miriam's estimation, when she was being useful rather than just present. The call from Darren came 11 days later. He'd been checking accounts. He called it reviewing our financial situation when he spoke to Helen about it. But what he was doing, based on the content of what followed, was discovering that things were not configured the way he'd assumed they were. Helen called Miriam first. Mom. Her voice had a specific quality, controlled but barely. Did you do something with the accounts? With the trust? I restructured some things, Miriam said. The trust provisions were over for review. I should have done it years ago, Darren is. Helen stopped. Started again. He says some things were changed without our knowledge, Helen. Miriam kept her voice even. Calm the way she was calm in chambers, the way she was calm when attorneys lost their tempers in front of her, and she let them finish before reminding them, gently, of where they were. The trust was established by me. The trustee authority is mine until you're 40. Every change I made was legal, documented, and disclosed to Cecile. Nothing was hidden. Everything is still yours. Nothing that belongs to you was touched. A long pause. But Darren's name was on an account he shouldn't have access to, Miriam said. That's been corrected. Longer this time. He's really upset, Helen said finally. I know, Miriam said. I imagine he is. He wants to talk to you. I'm available Thursday afternoon between 2 and 4. He can call then. When Darren called Thursday at 2:15, his voice had an edge that he was working hard to keep professional. He'd clearly prepared, he had language. Words like overreach and breach of trust and family consultation. Phrases that he'd probably rehearsed. Miriam let him finish. Darren, she said when he was done. I understand you feel blindsided. I feel like you made major financial decisions affecting our family without any input from. Let me be precise, she said, and her voice shifted slightly. Not louder, not harder, but clearer. The way her voice shifted in court when she wanted to signal to everyone in the room that what she was about to say was the part they needed to remember. The trust was created by me, funded by me, and governed by terms I established before you and Helen were married. My authority over it is not contingent on your input or approval. The accounts I modified were accounts that Helen's name was on independently of you. The property deed on the Westchester house reflects Helen's contribution, which was documented at closing. I have not touched a single asset that is legally yours. Silence. What I have done, she continued, is ensure that the financial structure around my daughter reflects the reality of where those assets came from and who they belong to. I did this quietly, without drama and without asking anyone's permission, because I didn't need anyone's permission. More silence. That voicemail you left me, she said. The one from October 17th at 11:47 p.m. I kept it. She heard him breathe. You called me a weight, she said, on the family dynamic. You said Helen agreed. Miriam, I'm not angry, she said. I want you to understand that. I'm not calling you to fight. I'm calling to be clear. If you'd like to speak again, you're welcome to have your attorney contact Cecile Fontaine. Her number is on file. She ended the call. She sat for a moment in her office, her real office, the one on the 23rd floor with the federal seal on the wall and the case files stacked in order of hearing date, and felt something she could only describe as the particular satisfaction of a problem that had been addressed properly. Not revenge, not punishment, clarity. Helen came to see her alone 3 weeks later. No Darren, no Lena. Just Helen, in her coat with the broken button she hadn't replaced yet, sitting at Miriam's kitchen table with a mug of tea, and the look of someone who had been doing a lot of thinking in private. He told me he borrowed the 40,000 months ago, Helen said. I know. You knew before I did? I suspected. I didn't want to tell you what to think about your own marriage. Helen wrapped both hands around the mug. He's been telling me for years that you were intrusive, overbearing, that you made him feel small. Miriam didn't say anything, but I think what he meant was that you made him nervous, Helen said, because you notice things. I notice most things, Miriam said. Why didn't you ever say something to me earlier? Miriam thought about this honestly before she answered. Because you didn't ask, and because you have your own mind, and you've always had your own mind, and I was afraid that if I said what I saw, you'd feel like I was taking something from you, your own judgment. Helen looked at the table. The house is mine, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Always was, Miriam said. And the trust. It's structured so that it goes directly to you at 40. He can't access it. There's nothing to access. It's a clean line. Helen nodded slowly. Then she looked up. What did you tell him? On the phone? I told him to have his attorney call Cecile if he wanted to discuss further. Something crossed Helen's face, something complicated, a little grief and a little relief, and something else that might have been recognition. You didn't yell at him, she said. No, you didn't threaten him. No, you just… Helen gestured slightly, searching for it. You just made it very clear. That's usually enough, Miriam said, when the clarity is real. They sat together in the kitchen for another 2 hours. They talked about when Helen was 10 and had found a red-tailed hawk with an injured wing and had documented its recovery in a notebook for 3 months. They talked about a trip they'd always meant to take together to the coast of Maine that had never happened. Helen cried a little, toward the end. Not dramatically, just the kind of quiet cry that happens when you've been holding something for a long time and suddenly there's a safe place to set it down. Miriam made more tea. The divorce took 14 months. Miriam did not insert herself into the proceedings except where Helen asked for her help. And when Helen asked, she helped with the complete attention and precision that she brought to everything she cared about. She did not have to use her position to do this. She had, as she had tried to make clear to anyone who had underestimated her over the course of 54 years, plenty of tools. She was at the house in Westchester on the day Darren moved his things out, not inside. She sat in her 12-year-old Honda at the curb because Helen had asked her to be nearby, not because she wanted to supervise, but because she was the kind of mother who understood the difference between presence and interference. She watched a moving truck idle in the driveway. She watched 3 men carry boxes of architecture books and drafting equipment and a very expensive espresso machine onto the truck. She watched Darren come out of the house once, look briefly in her direction, and look away. He never said anything to her again. Lena, who was 8 and fierce and curious about everything, called her grandmother the following Saturday and asked if she could come and spend the night because she wanted to look for hawks. Miriam said yes. She drove to pick up her granddaughter in the 12-year-old Honda. She thought about getting the brake pads replaced, finally, and about the trip to Maine that she and Helen had talked about. She thought about the red-tailed hawk that a 10-year-old had documented in a notebook 30 years ago, and about how the most important things were often the smallest ones, the ones you had to pay attention to catch. She thought about a 43-second voicemail, and the particular satisfaction of a problem handled quietly, without drama, without announcing itself, in the way that real power moves, not like a storm, but like water finding its level, the kind that doesn't declare itself, the kind that just arrived. And that's the story of Miriam Holt, the woman who said nothing, did everything, and let the consequences arrive on their own schedule. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who didn't take the time to learn who you actually were, you know exactly what it felt like when that moving truck pulled away. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. We read every single one. And if you're new to Velvet Reckoning, subscribe. Because the stories we tell here are for the people who never stopped being powerful, even when someone tried very hard to convince them otherwise.